welcome you all to this panel with the title, Is the US-EU alliance beyond repair or not? The dominant question of these days. I have to explain that the composition of this panel has changed several times because due to also this strike of yesterday. But I'm glad to have with us first Mr. Timčo Mucunski. Do I pronounce it?
Correct.
Okay, correctly. He is Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade of the Republic of Northern Macedonia. Next to him, it's Mr. James Lindsay. Mr. James Lindsay is a distinguished senior fellow in U.S. foreign policy matters for the Council of Foreign Relations. The history of this council goes back to 1921. It's a well-known think tank, educator, and the publisher of the famous Foreign Affairs. And next to him is Mr. Howard Shatz, a senior economist of the also well-known RAND organization. As I explained, the main question, or maybe the only question, is the title of this panel. But I asked the participants to give an eye also in the past, in which place we were before this Trump hurricane. What was the past before? So, starting from you, Minister, your country is new, but you have an idea of how US and EU relations were before on diplomatic level, on economic also level, about currency matters, before to go and make some perspective, to see the future before.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation to be at this forum. Allow me to say that, first of all, it's a pleasure to be in Delphi. Allow me just to use 30 seconds to thank both the Greek government and the Greek people for their outreach that they did for my nation only a few weeks ago when there was a tragic event in the city of Kočani. The lives of many individuals were directly saved by your doctors and your nurses. I had the pleasure of visiting the hospitals in Thessaloniki, and what I can say is that the honest solidarity that was shown, as I say once again, by both your government, but as well as your people and your medical professionals, is something that will remain in the memory of my nation forever, and I thank you for that. Allow me to say, and this is a topic that has been of huge importance since, as you said, the independence of my country, but since the process of Euro-Atlantic integration has taken the dynamic that it has today, and that is the active input that US foreign policy has had in Europe, and especially in the region where we currently live. The US has been a huge investor in stability in this region. Both political stability, stability from a security perspective, but also economic and trade stability. And my personal view is that approach by US foreign policy hasn't changed and will not change. What has changed is some principles that are applied, and we have to take them we have to take our American friends as honest brokers in this situation. We have to look at the risk and the challenges that we face, and these are very similar risks and challenges that we faced in the past. The issues like the current interplay that obviously exists between the obvious threat that we always talk about, and that is Russia, but also the threat that we sometimes, or many in this region and in Europe, neglect to mention, and that is the threat coming from China, but also the interplay that you have coming from Iran, which we saw was active in our region in current developments in Albania only a few years ago with cyber threats, and also the fact that very close to us geographically here on the European continent, we have North Korean troops. So the risk of that interplay between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea is something that we haven't taken seriously enough. And I say that both from a political, security, as well as economic and trade perspective. These nations are seen by the US government as, I would say, strategic competition and strategic threat. There are governments in Europe, sadly, which still, for example, see China as a misunderstood trading partner. And if we have these different approaches, then we're not being honest between each other as to what the threats are. So right now, what is happening is, very obviously, NATO is changing its approach on many things. And I think it is changing to make itself a stronger alliance, not a weaker alliance. We saw that by the presence of Secretary of State Rubio, not only what he said publicly, but what he said to us foreign ministers only a week ago. The US is here to stay. The US is here to invest in stability. The US is here to invest in making NATO stronger, but we also need to take our share of responsibility. Smaller nations also have responsibility that, of course, are proportionately not equal in magnitude to what bigger nations do. But we have to understand that, first of all, we have to be commonly responsible in identifying what our threats are from a European perspective, from a regional perspective, and a global perspective. And if we are honest between each other, then I think it's not about repairing the strategic alliance and the transatlantic partnership, but it's about speaking on how we can make it better and stronger.
Okay. All right. Mr. Lindsay, being a specialist of foreign affairs and security, what is an assessment of the past?
Well, first, Pollux, thank you very much for moderating today's panel. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's a great delight to be here at the Delphi Economic Forum. You ask a big question that people far more talented than I have written massive books on. So I'm going to give you sort of the short version, which is for the United States, after the end of World War II, there was the firm conclusion that America's national security, its economic prosperity, hinged fundamentally on the fate of Europe. And for the past 80 years, the transatlantic relationship has been that foundation of American foreign policy. Beginning with the Marshall Plan after the end of World War II, the United States reached the conclusion that European integration was critical to American security and prosperity. It was George Kennan who wrote that our goal was to try to persuade the Europeans to act like Europeans rather than like nationalists. So in that sense, the European project had at the macro level the backing of the United States. Now, to say that the United States wanted to work with Europe and saw Europe as its partner did not mean that there were no conflicts over the last 80 years in U.S.-European relations. People here in this room can probably run through a number of them. Vietnam was one, deployment of nuclear weapons, another one, the Iraq War, another one. We can continue down the list, but I would say cooperation triumphed over conflict in the relationship. And I will also note that from the vantage point of Washington, of course, even though we talk about Europe, there's a great richness and diversity in views in European capitals as what the United States should do to serve their vision of European integration and European security. What I would say to you, though, Pollux, the people in the room, is that for President Donald Trump, none of what I just said is persuasive. And for President Trump, his view of the world, as he has put it, the EU was created to, pardon my language, screw the United States. And he believes that America's allies are as big, if not a bigger threat to American security and prosperity than America's adversaries. And I think it's that thinking that is really going to shape the relationship going forward. And I do think we are in a very difficult, very dangerous moment in transatlantic relations. And I would not assume that everything is going to work out okay because it has worked out well in the past.
Okay. Mr. Shatz, Howard, if we take the perspective of economy, commercial relations, currency also matters.
So,
Dollar versus euro.
yeah. So
What do you see so far?
I'm going to talk about the past, but I want to say first up front, the US-EU relationship is a remarkable relationship. Right? And I think it is unprecedented in history, and I think we have to keep that in mind. And so from an economic perspective, one example is combined foreign direct investment in our two economies is more than $5 trillion. Right? That's an enormous relationship, which is going to be hard to break up. That said, let me talk about the worst moments in our relationship. And I think that might give some insight that it hasn't always been good, and we go in waves. Let's start with the Marshall Plan. Remarkable. The United States went to Europe and said, give us your plan. We rejected it completely. Too many trade barriers, too much local content. Instead, we said, you will trade with each other. Even back then, when we were instituting the Marshall Plan, the Netherlands, for example, was very suspicious of US intentions. It took a big PR effort, including a very cute book with a traditional Dutch fisherman, to convince the Dutch people to sign up to the Marshall Plan. It probably didn't help that during those years, 1948 to 49, the United States sanctioned the Netherlands. All right, so this is a first example of where we took stiff action, very difficult action, against our European partners. Let's move forward to the 1960s. At this point, America is the dominant economic power. It has been the dominant economic power. What was the big bestseller? It was Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber's book, The Défi Americain, The Challenge American, The American Challenge. How do we keep Europe from being an American colony? Again, difficult situation. Jump forward to the 1980s, 1982, right? Europe wanted a gas pipeline with Russia. The United States didn't want that. What did we do? We basically sanctioned Europe again. All right? We prohibited American companies and European subsidiaries from participating in this pipeline. It was resolved. Let me finish the little tour of worst moments with 10% tariffs. Okay, 10% tariffs. Let's come back to 1971. It's going to sound very familiar. The United States was facing an unsustainable current account deficit. There was monetary problems. And so what did the United States do? Without telling anyone, we went off the gold standard, we abandoned Bretton Woods, and we instituted 10% tariffs. All right? And we went to our European partners, the G10. We eventually reached an agreement in which 6 of the European countries formed a monetary union and floated against the dollar. So I think if we look through long waves of history, we see, yes, we're great partners, but we each have our own interests, and we'll exercise those interests, sometimes in very difficult ways. And that kind of gives some insight into how we might think about the current situation.
Okay. So, Minister, what is your perspective for the future? Of course, your country has to become member of the EU first. Also, maybe you can give us your feeling about this relation, your country's relation and EU. But how do you see the EU and the US relations in the future beyond Trump's administration? The end of history is not Trump, of course.
Yes. Of course, but what is also evident is that US foreign policy is always very strategic. On the other hand, if there is strategic ambiguities between two sides, that creates strategic vulnerabilities. And if we look at the intention of what is US foreign policy right now, it is to highlight some of the strategic ambiguities that obviously exist. It was what created a situation in Europe where Europe took a more serious approach on security spending and on defense spending, something that is necessary for ourselves, for our common security and defense interest, was a more direct approach by the US administration. So it was necessary for somebody to give us here on this continent a wake-up call to collectively realize that we need to take our burden for something that is our responsibility. Because the Wales commitment was always perceived as the ceiling. But the Wales commitment was never created to be the ceiling of defense spending. It was always created to be the floor of defense spending. And thankfully now, because of the behavior of the current US administration, we are now talking not just about modernizing our militaries, but we are finally talking about investment and modernization of our domestic defense industries, which is something from a political security perspective that is an absolute necessity, not just for the European Union, but for Europe as a whole. I represent the country that became the first country in the Western Balkans that signed a security and defense partnership with the European Union a few months ago, which means that the European Union is now starting outreach to countries outside of the European Union on issues related to security and defense, which means that we now have a full understanding that the burden sharing of collective responsibility cannot be just an obligation of our transatlantic partner, but is also our obligation as well. When it comes to my nation's path towards the European Union, I like to point out in many discussions where I'm present abroad that this year is a sobering anniversary for us. It is 20 years since we received candidate status for joining the EU. And to date, we have still not opened accession negotiations with the European Union, although many, many years ago, we fulfilled the criteria for opening accession negotiations with the European Union. We are doing our part to try to unblock this process. As many of you know, we have been victims to bilateral criteria over and over and over again. We are a nation that is geographically in Europe. We are a nation that on the basis of values is in Europe, a nation that has to do a lot more on its path towards EU membership, but a nation that has deserved in the past to open accession negotiations. And this comes back to the issue that we were previously speaking about. Enlargement of the European Union into the Western Balkans is not just a necessity for the Union for economic and trade reasons, it is a necessity for the political and security stability of the European continent. Allowing a vacuum in the Western Balkans, which currently the EU is at this moment allowing, because of the gap between commitments and delivery, or to be more concise, promises it has made to our region and lack of delivery, is allowing these types of malign actors, such as Russia, such as China, to exert influence. So the message that we sent to Brussels, but as well as the member states, here I am in a member state that understands this, the necessity of moving the Western Balkans forward. But in all member states, I mentioned that it is a common mutual necessity that a tangible way forward for the Western Balkans is found, and a way that closes the gap between the commitments on one side, the many windows of opportunity that we've been promised in the past. This is a term that is very often used. Now is the window of opportunity. Now you have the momentum, but the delivery on the EU side is what has been lacking. And from that perspective, what I could say is one of the strongest, most tangible supporters of enlargement of the European Union has always been the United States. And this is something that we need to keep into consideration. Yes, the United States is not a member of the European Union, but the United States has vested interest in the stability of this region.
Okay. Jim, your perspective, but also I would like especially to focus, is it a realistic prospect of the US ever withdrawing from NATO under President Trump, but also someone else in the future? Is this well-known saying of Lord Ismay keeps some value till today?
Is it in the realm of possibility that the United States would leave NATO? Yes, it is in the realm of possibility. But what I would suggest to you, Pollux, is that is not the only question that really is at play. Because it's not simply a matter of whether the United States is in or out, but how committed is the United States to NATO? And the flip side of that is how convinced are other members of NATO that the United States will make good on its commitments? I am not surprising anyone here to tell you that President Trump has raised lots of questions about whether or not countries can rely on the security guarantee that the United States has historically provided, not just to Europe, but also to our friends and allies in Asia. And there are going to be a number of issues coming up in the months and years to come that really could test things. And again, Congress 2 years ago now put a provision in a rule of law saying that the United States could not leave NATO without congressional or Senate consent. But it's not clear that, one, that's constitutional. But number two, what is more important, again, is that NATO, for its deterrent purposes, rests fundamentally on the belief of all involved that the United States will be there at the existential moment. And I think President Trump has thrown real doubt on that. And I want to go back to sort of a point that Howard made. He was quite right that in 1971, closing the gold window was a massive shock to Europe. They were quite unhappy about what had happened. But I think what we shouldn't lose sight of in that situation is that there was no question about Richard Nixon's commitment to NATO, to the defense of the West. I think, again, with President Trump, there's a real question as to whether he's there. One of the things I think people also need to keep in mind looking forward is, what are the decisions that the Trump administration make on U.S. force posture going forward? One of the issues being debated right now, and it's been reported, is there is talk that the Trump administration is looking at reducing the size of the United States Army from its current end strength of 450,000 soldiers to as low as 360,000. Well, if that were to happen, that would have massive consequences for U.S. military force posture in Europe. And it is not out of the realm of possibility that the United States could withdraw most, if not all, of its troops from Europe. Raises very big questions. And again, against the backdrop, we haven't talked about it, is the Trump administration's approach to Ukraine in its efforts to fundamentally reset U.S. relations with Russia. The big question is, if we do get a deal, and again, there's question marks as to whether that's possible, what will the contours of that deal be, and how much will the United States give up from the vantage point of Europe and European security to achieve it? I just think there are incredibly turbulent times ahead, so my advice would be to buckle up.
Okay. Howard, taking in consideration the current Trump administration, but beyond this, US and EU are, in fact, partners or competitors?
Yes.
Yeah, let's see.
They are absolutely commercial competitors, especially in the realm of technology, for example, but also in other goods. But they're also partners. Now, let me build off the partnership, because we are, when Jim answered, could we leave NATO, I think that highlights that we're in a realm of quite great uncertainty, right? So we can look back. They have been great partners at constructing a rules-based international system and protecting it. But we don't know how that will unfold. So I think the way I look at it, what are the sources of uncertainty? Why is the US doing what it's doing? I don't think it's particularly targeting policies at the EU, right? The US faces economically, the US faces two enormous problems. And this is why I wanted to bring up 1971. One enormous problem is government spending. So in 2019, government spending in the US was about 4.4 trillion. In 2024, it was almost 6.8 trillion, right? And that's not just inflation. Structurally, things were built in that is leading the US government to want to cut and cut deeply, right? The other big issue is the United States is the market of last resort for the world. So we've been running a goods trade deficit of above 3% of our GDP since 1999, right? This is unsustainable. And so this is why you see talk about a Mar-a-Lago Accord, talk about Stephen Moran, the new head of the Council of Economic Advisors, talking about resetting the global trade system. And if countries say, we're insulated from the United States, trade-wise, no one is insulated from the United States. Because if we don't absorb that, we're absorbing about 3% of total world trade, right? That's the US deficit. If we don't absorb that, it's going to have to go to someone else. or you have to stop producing. And so when I think about how does this end for the US and the EU, it ends on how the US solves this problem. And so in some ways, the EU is a bystander. In some ways, all the countries of the world are bystanders. Now, they can influence. They can talk to the US. They can come up with solutions, right? How do we reset the global economy so that the US is not the market of last resort, so that the US does not have a goods trade deficit of 4% of GDP, right? This is the core issue that's driving, I think, US economic policy. And then we go into, competitors or partners. I tend to be, I'm a little dopily optimistic about the relationship. And talking about the future, I can be analytic, but how can you keep your own hopes when you think about the future? And when we look at, I started with competitors. Are they partners? Well, they're economically compatible. They both have high standards. They both have high social standards. They both make advanced goods. They're culturally compatible. There are historic ties, right? And so it's very hard to break apart this relationship. And I think that's what makes them, in the end, partners with the heightened uncertainty regarding how the US solves its domestic problems that it's really concentrating on.
Okay. We have 4 minutes, 1 minute per person. Are we still allies? And the notion of this West that goes from Europe to the other side of the Atlantic exists, keeps its notion or not?
In my view, without a doubt. We have heard in the last few weeks, for example, on the question of NATO. The United States, I think I've heard at least 4 times US officials tell us that the US is not leaving NATO, that it's working for a stronger NATO. So I plead, please don't make them tell us a 5th time. They've told us enough already. We know the US is here to stay in NATO and to make the alliance stronger. And it's very obvious by the actions. What is different, and examples were given of difficulties in this transatlantic relationship that have been there for over 40 to 50 years. What's different is social media wasn't here, mainstream media wasn't as present, and some of the issues that existed in the transatlantic relationship weren't as publicly overblown as they are now. In my view, and in everything that we've seen by the behavior of the US administration, yes, there will be different approaches to many issues, trade above all, but there will be a willingness to cooperate, there will be a willingness to engage, and when it comes to our common political security issues that are of mutual interest, and here I speak, for example, about the big risk, common risk we all have of authoritarian state capitalism, which is a mutual risk of this very special relationship, then we have to find common solutions together, and without a doubt, the United States is here to do that with us as Europe.
Okay. Jim, 1 minute.
I will say I don't think the question is whether we're going to be allies or not. I think the question is going to be how closely will we continue to work with one another, and to the extent that we become estranged, how bitter will that estrangement be? I will just say here, I am not the only one talking about concern, at least on this side of the Atlantic, about the US commitment to Europe. I will note that the incoming Chancellor of Germany has been very emphatic about this. And I can also point to a prime minister of a country just north of the United States on the same point. What I do think is going to be critical is not just the choices that not the United States makes, that Donald Trump makes. And I think this week has shown that whatever President Trump's advisors say, the only one who speaks for Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And I think it's very important to keep that in mind. But I think it's also important the choices that Europeans make. Everyone was elated yesterday, at least in the stock market, because the president rolled back some of his tariffs. And I get a sense it was like people who were overjoyed to discover that they only lost their leg and not their head. But they still have lost a leg. And I think this is going to be an issue going forward. And the question is, how do European leaders respond in the near term, but also over the long term? If the United States is not interested in trading with other countries and puts up barriers, people are going to look elsewhere to trade, and that has long-term consequences. It doesn't mean in the near term I can't get Kentucky Fried Chicken here in Athens, or I can't get Perrier water in the United States, but it does mean over the long term, you can end up in a very different place than you are today.
Okay, Howard? You?
The question is, will we remain partners?
Allies.
Allies. I think the nature of the alliance is most likely to change, but not the fact of alliance. I would put that. And there are commitments. So what I would look at the drivers of those commitments. The drivers of those commitments are the economic relationship. It's going to be very hard to unwind that. It's going to be very hard to unwind the very large trade relationship, right? There are businesses in both countries that are kind of built or optimized to trade with the other. And I refer to the EU as a country. I know it's not a country. So the nature of the trade and investment relationship. There's also, quite frankly, the security relationship that we can look at the headlines, but every day, multiple times in the year, U.S. military forces are exercising with European military forces throughout the continent. And there's just an amazingly close partnership, which again is going to be very hard to unwind. So, I would think that we are going to remain allies. The nature of the relationship might change. It will heavily depend on how the U.S. resolves its problems and whether Europe helps the U.S. resolve its problems in some way. And it also will depend on what the leadership in the U.S. wants, in particular the president. Mostly, yeah, we probably will, but we don't know.
Okay. So, Minister, Jim, Howard, and you all, thank you very much.